The engine was still warm under the hood when Dominic Marchetti stepped out of his car, and that alone told him something was wrong. He had not called ahead. He was not supposed to be home for another 6 hours. Yet the porch light was off. The curtains in the study were drawn tighter than usual, and the gravel driveway held tire marks that did not belong to any car he owned. He stood there for a moment, keys still in his hand, listening. The night was quiet in the way that felt wrong, not peaceful. A dog barked somewhere down the street, and then stopped too quickly. Dominic had spent 20 years learning to trust silence like this, the kind that came right before something broke. He walked toward the front door slowly, each step deliberate, his eyes moving from window to window. Nothing, no shadows, no movement. But the feeling in his chest did not ease. The door opened before he could reach for the handle. Elena stood there, one hand still on the doorframe, her face pale under the dim hallway light. She was the house's quiet, steady presence, the woman who had kept this home running for almost 6 years, without ever raising her voice or drawing attention to herself. Dominic barely registered her most days. Tonight, she looked directly into his eyes, and there was something there he had never seen from her before. Fear, controlled and sharp. "Mr. Marchetti," she said softly, glancing past his shoulder toward the driveway. "You need to listen to me right now, and you need to stay calm." Dominic froze mid-step. In his world, calm words delivered like that never meant anything good. He had heard men twice her size deliver threats with less weight than she just had. His hand instinctively moved toward the inside of his jacket, an old habit that had kept him alive more than once. "What is it?" he said, his voice low. Elena stepped closer, glancing behind her into the dark hallway before speaking again, barely above a whisper. "There are people in this house who should not be here. I don't know how many. I have not seen them, but I have heard them. Twice. Upstairs, near your office." For a moment, Dominic said nothing. The wind moved through the trees behind him, and somewhere far off, a car passed on the main road and faded away. He looked at Elena carefully, searching her face for any sign of exaggeration, any hint that she might be mistaken. He found none. Elena did not scare easily. In 6 years, he had never once heard her voice tremble the way it did now. "When?" he asked. "The first time was almost an hour ago," she said. "I thought it was Daniel checking the security system, so I did not think much of it. But Daniel does not carry his phone off silent, and when I called him 10 minutes ago, it went straight to voicemail. That has never happened before." Dominic's jaw tightened. Daniel Whitfield was his head of household security, a man who answered his phone within 2 rings, no matter the hour, no matter where he was. The idea that his line had gone dead silent was more unsettling than anything else Elena had said so far. "Where is he now?" Dominic asked. "I don't know," Elena admitted. "I have not seen him since he did his evening walk around the property. That was almost 2 hours ago." Dominic's mind moved quickly now, running through possibilities the way he had trained himself to do for decades. A rival family testing his defenses, a disgruntled associate looking for leverage, or something smaller, less organized, someone who had simply picked the wrong house on the wrong night. None of the options comforted him. He stepped inside slowly, motioning for Elena to stay close but quiet. The hallway light flickered once, a small detail that on any other night would have meant nothing. Tonight, it made his pulse quicken. "Did you call anyone else?" he asked. "Police, my brother, anyone?" Elena shook her head. "I didn't know what to do. I did not want to call the police in case it was nothing, and I did not want to leave the house in case it was something. And then I heard your car in the driveway, and I thought, at least now I am not the only one who knows." There was something almost apologetic in the way she said it, as though she feared she had done something wrong simply by being cautious. Dominic studied her for a moment, and for the first time in years, he saw her not as background furniture in his home, but as someone who had just made a decision that could have gone very badly for her. She could have said nothing. She could have assumed it was nothing and gone to bed. Instead, she had waited by the door for him, unsure if anyone was coming home at all that night. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "Now stay behind me." Elena nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly as she pressed them together in front of her. Dominic moved through the entryway with practiced control, each step measured, his breathing slow, and even, despite the tension building in his shoulders. The house he had lived in for over a decade suddenly felt unfamiliar, every corner a possible threat, every closed door a question waiting to be answered. He paused at the base of the staircase, looking up into the darkness above. The office Elena had mentioned was on the second floor, at the far end of the east hallway, a room that held files, records, and information that very few people were allowed to see. If someone had gone there specifically, it was not a random break-in. It was something else entirely. "Stay here," he whispered to Elena. "Do not follow me upstairs." "I'm not leaving you alone in this house," she whispered back, her voice steady, despite the fear still visible in her eyes. "If something happens to you, I will never forgive myself for staying quiet in the kitchen while it did." Dominic almost smiled, despite everything. There was a quiet strength in her that he had never noticed before, buried beneath years of politeness and routine. "Fine," he said. "But you stay 2 steps behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run, no arguing." Elena nodded once, firmly this time, and Dominic began climbing the stairs. Each step creaked softly beneath his weight, and he winced at the sound, though there was nothing to be done about it now. The upstairs hallway stretched ahead of him, lined with closed doors on either side, moonlight spilling faintly through a window at the far end near his office. He could see the door to the office was slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness where it should have been shut and locked. His pulse quickened, but his hands stayed steady. Behind him, Elena's breathing was quiet but quick, matching the tension that filled the narrow hallway. Dominic reached the top of the stairs and paused, listening again. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, the unmistakable sound of a drawer sliding shut somewhere inside the office. Someone was still in the house. Dominic's mind raced through what he knew. Daniel missing. 2 sets of footsteps Elena had heard earlier. A car outside that did not belong to anyone in the household. And now, confirmation that whoever had entered his home was still inside, moving through his most private space as though they had all the time in the world. He turned slightly toward Elena. Her wide eyes met his in the dim light. "Stay right here," he mouthed silently. "Do not make a sound." She nodded, pressing herself against the wall beside a small table near the top of the stairs, her hands gripping the edge of it tightly. Dominic moved forward, closer to the office door, every instinct in his body sharpened by years of navigating dangerous situations with a calm exterior, no matter what churned beneath it. He reached the door and paused just outside, listening to the faint sounds coming from within, the soft shuffle of papers, the careful, deliberate movements of someone searching for something specific. This was not a simple robbery. Robbers did not move with this kind of patience. Whoever was inside that room was looking for information, not valuables, and that thought alone told Dominic more about the danger he now faced than anything else that night. He glanced back once more at Elena, who remained frozen in place, watching him with an expression caught somewhere between fear and fierce determination. In that brief look, Dominic understood something clearly for the first time. Whatever happened next, in the following hours in this house, would change everything. Not just about tonight, but about who he trusted, who protected him, and who had been protecting him all along without him ever noticing. He reached out slowly and pushed the office door open another inch, just enough to see inside, his entire body coiled with readiness, his mind racing through every possible outcome of the next 60 seconds. And somewhere inside that room, a shadow moved. Dominic did not push the door further. Instead, he stepped back, silent and controlled, and motioned for Elena to move toward the small linen closet at the end of the hallway. She understood immediately, slipping inside without a sound, and Dominic followed her, pulling the door almost shut behind them, leaving only a narrow gap to see through. "What are you doing?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did we stop?" "Because walking into that room without knowing how many people are in there is a mistake," Dominic answered quietly. "I need to think, not react." Through the gap in the closet door, they watched the hallway. A minute passed, then another, the silence stretching long enough that Elena's fingers curled tightly around the edge of a shelf beside her. Then the office door opened wider, and a man stepped out into the hallway, moving with the same unhurried confidence Dominic had noticed from the sounds earlier. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, carrying a small leather folder under one arm. He paused at the top of the stairs, glancing down toward the entryway before turning and walking the opposite direction, deeper into the house. Dominic's stomach tightened. That folder likely held documents he could not afford to lose, records of business dealings that were never meant to leave this house. But more than that, the calm way the man moved told him this was someone experienced, someone who had done this kind of work before. "There's at least one more," Elena whispered. "I heard 2 different voices earlier, before you arrived." Dominic nodded slowly. He needed to find Daniel, and he needed to do it without alerting whoever else was moving through his home. He eased the closet door open and stepped back into the hallway, gesturing for Elena to stay close but silent behind him. They moved toward the office first, now empty, the drawers of his desk pulled open, papers scattered across the floor, where the intruder had clearly worked in haste, before hearing something and deciding to move. Dominic crouched down, scanning quickly what remained, his mind cataloging what was missing versus what had simply been disturbed. A drawer that held old correspondence was empty. A locked cabinet near the window had been forced open, its contents gone. "They knew exactly what they were looking for," Dominic murmured. "Which means someone told them where to look," Elena said quietly. Dominic looked up at her sharply. It was a simple observation, but it cut straight to the center of what troubled him most. Whoever had sent people into his home tonight had detailed knowledge of the house, knowledge that only a handful of people possessed. That thought alone narrowed the list of suspects in ways that made his chest tighten with a different kind of unease, one that had nothing to do with the immediate danger and everything to do with betrayal. They left the office and continued down the hallway, checking each room quickly and quietly. Dominic's mind kept circling back to Daniel. A man like Daniel Whitfield did not simply disappear during his evening rounds, not unless something had happened to stop him, and if the intruders had gone through the trouble of dealing with him, that raised the stakes considerably. Near the end of the hallway, close to the small side staircase that led down toward the garden entrance, Elena stopped suddenly, her hand catching Dominic's sleeve. "Listen," she whispered. Dominic held still. Faintly, from somewhere below, came the muffled sound of movement, something shifting against a hard floor, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone trying to signal without being able to call out. He moved toward the staircase quickly but carefully, Elena close behind him, and as they descended, the sound grew clearer, coming from a small storage room near the garden entrance that was rarely used for anything beyond seasonal decorations and old furniture. Dominic pushed the door open and found Daniel seated on the floor, his hands bound in front of him with plastic ties, a strip of tape across his mouth, his eyes wide with a mixture of frustration and relief when he saw who had opened the door. He was clearly unharmed beyond the discomfort of his restraints, and the sight of him alive eased something in Dominic's chest that he had not realized was so tightly wound. Elena moved past Dominic immediately, kneeling beside Daniel and carefully peeling the tape away from his mouth, while Dominic worked at the ties around his wrists. "How many?" Dominic asked quietly the moment Daniel could speak. "2 that I saw," Daniel said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Maybe 3. They came from the garden side, moved fast, knew exactly where the cameras had blind spots. This was planned, Dominic, planned in detail." "Did you see faces?" Dominic asked. Daniel shook his head. They kept their faces covered, but one of them, the one who spoke, had a voice I recognized. I couldn't place it right away, but I know I've heard it before, somewhere connected to business, not personal. Dominic's mind raced through the list of business associates and rivals he had crossed paths with over the years, searching for a voice, a manner of speaking, anything that might match. Nothing came immediately, but the possibility that this was connected to his professional world, rather than random chance, settled heavily over him. Elena finished freeing Daniel's wrists, and he flexed his fingers slowly, wincing at the stiffness. "There's something else," he said, looking between Dominic and Elena. "Before they tied me up, I heard one of them mention a name, Edward. They said something like, 'Tell Edward it's done once we have the folder.'" Dominic's expression hardened instantly. Edward Callahan was a name he knew well, a business rival who had spent the better part of 2 years trying to undercut Dominic's legitimate ventures through legal channels, all without success. If Callahan had grown desperate enough to send people into Dominic's home to steal information, it meant the man believed he had run out of other options, and desperate men made dangerous decisions. "We need to move," Dominic said, helping Daniel to his feet. "If they still have the folder, we can't let them leave the property with it." "There's a car parked 2 streets over," Daniel said. "I saw it earlier during my rounds, before everything went quiet. I thought it was odd, but didn't think much of it at the time." Dominic nodded, already forming a plan in his mind. "Elena, I need you to call Nathan and Peter right now. Tell them to come quietly. No sirens, no announcement. Have them cover the front gate and the side entrance near the garden. If these men try to leave, I want them stopped before they reach that car." Elena hesitated only a moment before pulling her phone from her apron pocket, her fingers moving quickly across the screen as she stepped a few feet away to make the call, her voice low and controlled despite everything that had happened in the last hour. Daniel steadied himself against the wall, still recovering from being restrained for so long, but his eyes were sharp and alert despite the ordeal. "Dominic," he said quietly, "how did you know to come home early tonight? Nothing about your schedule should have changed." Dominic paused, considering the question. "I didn't know anything was wrong until I pulled into the driveway. It was Elena who warned me the moment I walked through the door." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly, glancing toward Elena, who was still speaking quietly into her phone a short distance away. "She noticed something was wrong before you even arrived?" "She heard movement upstairs almost an hour before I got home," Dominic said. "She waited by the door instead of running, instead of hiding, and told me the moment I stepped inside. If she hadn't done that, I would have walked into this house completely unaware." Daniel studied Elena for a long moment, something like quiet respect crossing his expression. "I've worked with a lot of people who claim to notice everything and see nothing. She's the opposite, quiet, careful, and apparently sharper than any of us gave her credit for." Dominic said nothing, but the thought had already been forming in his mind since the moment she opened the front door with that steady, controlled fear in her eyes. Elena had spent years in this house, moving quietly through rooms, remembering small details, noticing things that others overlooked simply because she was never truly seen as anything more than part of the household routine. Tonight had changed that entirely. Elena returned a moment later, sliding her phone back into her pocket. "Nathan and Peter are on their way. 10 minutes, maybe less. They said they will come in from the back road so no one sees their headlights from the street." "Good," Dominic said. "Daniel, can you walk?" "I can walk," Daniel confirmed, straightening up despite the stiffness in his shoulders. "Just point me in the right direction." Dominic looked toward the garden entrance, then back toward the main house, weighing their next move carefully. The intruders were still somewhere on the property, possibly already making their way toward the car Daniel had spotted earlier. If they moved too quickly, they risked alerting the men and causing them to scatter. If they moved too slowly, the intruders might escape entirely with whatever information they had taken. "We split up," Dominic said finally. "Daniel, head toward the side entrance and keep watch, but stay out of sight. Elena and I will check the garden path. If you see anyone, do not confront them directly. Just signal Nathan and Peter the moment they arrive." Daniel nodded and moved off toward the side entrance, favoring one leg slightly but managing to walk with reasonable speed. Dominic turned to Elena, who was watching him with an expression that mixed determination with lingering nerves. "You don't have to come with me," he said quietly. "You've already done more than enough tonight." "I'm not staying behind while you walk out into that garden alone," Elena said firmly. "Not after everything that has already happened." Dominic studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in the way he looked at her, an understanding that this woman standing in front of him, who had spent years quietly managing his household without ever asking for recognition, possessed a kind of courage that many people twice her size and with far more training completely lacked. "Stay close," he said finally, "and if I tell you to get down, you get down immediately. No hesitation." Elena nodded, and together they moved toward the back door that led out into the garden, the night air cool and still around them, the only sound the distant hum of insects and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Dominic scanned the darkened garden carefully, his eyes adjusting slowly, searching for any sign of movement among the shadows cast by the tall hedges and scattered trees. Near the far end of the garden, close to the low stone wall that marked the edge of the property, A faint shape moved briefly between two trees before disappearing again. Dominic's pulse quickened, and he raised a hand slightly, signaling Elena to stop and stay low. They had found them. Dominic crouched low behind a row of tall hedges, pulling Elena down beside him, with a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder. Through a gap in the leaves, he watched the two shapes moving near the stone wall, speaking to each other in low voices that carried faintly across the still night air. One of them held the leather folder Dominic had seen earlier, tucked securely under one arm, while the other kept glancing back toward the house as though checking for followers. "They're heading for the wall," Elena whispered, barely moving her lips. "If they climb over, they'll be on the street where the car is parked." Dominic nodded slightly, his mind working quickly. Nathan and Peter were still several minutes away, and if the two men reached that wall before help arrived, there would be nothing to stop them from disappearing into the night. With whatever information they had already stolen, he needed another option, something that would slow them down without forcing a dangerous confrontation in the dark. His eyes moved across the garden, searching for anything useful, and settled on the old irrigation system control box mounted near the base of a large oak tree close to where the two men stood. It was something Dominic had installed years ago, more out of convenience than necessity, allowing him to control the garden's sprinklers remotely from an application on his phone. An idea formed quickly. He pulled out his phone, shielding the light of the screen with his other hand, and opened the application. The men were standing almost directly above one of the sprinkler heads near the wall. Dominic hesitated only a moment before pressing the command to activate the system. Water burst upward suddenly and forcefully, catching both men completely by surprise. One of them stumbled backward with a sharp exclamation, momentarily losing his footing on the wet grass, while the other instinctively raised his arms to shield his face, the leather folder slipping from beneath his arm and landing on the ground. "Now," Dominic whispered, and he moved quickly from behind the hedge, Elena following close behind him, staying low as they crossed the open stretch of lawn. The commotion had given them precious seconds, and Dominic used them well. He reached the folder before either man could recover fully, snatching it up from the wet grass while Elena hung back near the hedge, watching carefully for any sign of additional threats. One of the men, recovering quickly despite being soaked, turned toward Dominic with sudden aggression, but before he could take more than a single step, bright headlights swept across the garden from the direction of the back road, and two car doors slammed shut in quick succession. Nathan and Peter had arrived. "Stay right there," Nathan called out firmly, moving swiftly across the lawn with Peter close behind him. Both men were well built, calm under pressure, trained specifically for moments exactly like this one. The two intruders exchanged a quick glance, clearly weighing their options, but with the exits effectively blocked, and the element of surprise completely gone, they had little choice but to raise their hands slowly in a gesture of surrender. Dominic stood there for a moment, the recovered folder held tightly in his hands, water still dripping from the nearby sprinklers onto the grass around them. The tension that had gripped his chest since stepping out of his car earlier that night finally began to ease, though he knew this was far from over. "Get them inside," Dominic said to Nathan. "Separate rooms. I want to speak with each of them individually before we decide what happens next." Nathan nodded, motioning for Peter to take one of the men while he guided the other, both intruders walking without resistance now, soaked, and clearly aware that the situation had turned entirely against them. Elena stepped closer to Dominic as the group moved back toward the house, her eyes fixed on the folder in his hands. "Is everything still inside?" she asked quietly. Dominic opened the folder briefly, scanning the contents under the dim light coming from the house. The documents appeared intact, records of certain business arrangements he had kept carefully guarded for years, arrangements that would cause significant complications if they fell into the wrong hands or were made public through the wrong channels. "It's all here," he said, closing the folder firmly. Whatever they were planning to do with this, they didn't get the chance. They walked back through the garden together, the earlier tension slowly giving way to something calmer, though Dominic's mind was already turning toward the next set of questions that needed answers. Who exactly had hired these men? How they had known precisely where to look inside his office, and most importantly, who among the people he trusted might have provided that information. Inside the house, Nathan and Peter had secured the two men in separate rooms on the ground floor, both still dripping wet from the unexpected encounter with the sprinkler system. Daniel joined them in the hallway, having recovered enough from his own ordeal to stand steadily, though he still moved with some care. "What do you want to do with them?" Daniel asked, glancing toward the closed doors of the rooms where the intruders waited. "I want answers first," Dominic said. "Then we decide." He moved toward the first room, where one of the men sat on a simple wooden chair, his hand still slightly raised in a habitual gesture of surrender, even though no one was actively threatening him. The man looked up as Dominic entered, his expression a careful mixture of defiance and calculation. "You know who I am," Dominic said calmly, closing the door behind him. "So let's skip the part where you pretend you don't." The man said nothing at first, his jaw tight, clearly weighing how much cooperation might benefit him in this situation. Dominic remained patient, understanding that pressure applied too quickly often produced less reliable information than patience applied correctly. "I'm not interested in hurting you," Dominic continued evenly. "I'm interested in understanding exactly what tonight was about, and who sent you here. Give me that, and this conversation can be much shorter and much easier for everyone involved." The man exhaled slowly, glancing toward the door as though considering his limited options. "We were hired through an intermediary," he finally admitted. "Never met the person directly who wanted the job done, just given instructions, a layout of the house, and told exactly which room to target." "A layout of the house," Dominic repeated, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger building beneath the surface. "Where did that layout come from?" "I don't know," the man said, and something in his tone suggested genuine uncertainty rather than deliberate evasion. "It was detailed, though. Floor plans, camera positions, even mentioned which staff member usually locked up last for the night." Dominic's mind immediately turned toward the small circle of people who possessed that kind of detailed knowledge about his household routines. It was not a long list, and the implications of someone on that list providing information to outsiders settled uncomfortably in his chest. "The name Edward," Dominic said. "Does that mean anything to you?" The man's eyes flickered slightly, a small but telling reaction. "That's the name mentioned during the arrangement. Never met him personally, but the instructions definitely came down through someone using that name." Dominic nodded slowly, his suspicions regarding Edward Callahan now feeling considerably more solid. He left the room without further questioning, moving instead to where Elena waited in the hallway alongside Daniel, both watching him carefully as he emerged. "Well?" Daniel asked. "Confirmed what we suspected," Dominic said. "Someone provided detailed information about this house, information that only a small number of people would have access to." Elena's expression shifted slightly, something like unease crossing her features. "You think someone here, someone who works for you, gave them that information?" "I don't know yet," Dominic said honestly, "but it's a possibility I can't ignore." Daniel crossed his arms, thinking carefully. The staff who would know the full layout, camera positions, and locking routines narrows down to very few people. Myself, obviously. Elena, Martin, who handles the grounds, and Charlotte, who used to manage the kitchen staff before she left last year. Dominic's attention sharpened at the last name. Charlotte left under difficult circumstances, didn't she? Daniel nodded slowly. She was let go after that dispute over missing funds from the household accounts. She was furious about it, always maintained she had done nothing wrong, though the evidence at the time suggested otherwise. Elena spoke up quietly. "I always felt uncertain about how that situation was handled. Charlotte was upset, understandably so, but I never truly believed she would go this far. Not something like tonight." Dominic considered this carefully. People driven by a sense of injustice, whether real or perceived, often made choices they would never have considered under normal circumstances. If Charlotte had felt wronged by her dismissal, and had since found herself connected to someone like Edward Callahan, willing to pay for information about Dominic's household, the pieces began fitting together in a way that made uncomfortable sense. "We need to find her," Dominic said, quietly, without drawing attention. "If she provided this information, she'll know things about Callahan's plans that we desperately need to understand." Before Daniel could respond, Peter appeared from the second room down the hallway, his expression tense. "You should hear this," he said, glancing back toward the room where the second intruder waited. He's saying something about tonight not being the only plan in motion. Dominic's chest tightened at those words, and he moved quickly toward the second room, Elena and Daniel close behind him. Inside, the second man sat with considerably less defiance than the first, his earlier confidence apparently shaken by whatever consequences he now anticipated for his involvement in tonight's failed operation. "Tell him what you told me," Peter instructed. The man looked up at Dominic nervously. "The folder wasn't the only objective tonight. There's something else happening. Something bigger, planned for tomorrow. I only know bits and pieces. But Callahan is planning something involving your business partners. Something meant to happen regardless of whether we succeeded here tonight." Dominic's mind raced immediately toward the meeting scheduled for the following afternoon, an important gathering with several of his most valuable business partners, discussions that had taken months to arrange, and held significant weight for future arrangements. If Callahan intended to disrupt or sabotage that meeting somehow, the stakes extended far beyond tonight's failed break-in. "What exactly is planned?" Dominic demanded, his calm exterior finally showing cracks of urgency. "I don't know the details," the man insisted, and something in his tone suggested genuine fear, rather than continued deception. "Just that whatever happens tomorrow was always the real plan, and tonight was supposed to make it easier by getting information that would strengthen his position." Dominic stood there for a long moment, processing everything, his mind working through the pieces with rapid precision. Charlotte's possible involvement, Callahan's determination, a meeting tomorrow that suddenly felt far more dangerous than it had just hours earlier. He turned to Elena, whose face reflected the same growing concern that filled his own thoughts. "We don't have much time," he said quietly. "Whatever Callahan is planning for tomorrow, we need to understand it before that meeting begins." Elena met his gaze steadily, despite the exhaustion visible in her expression after everything that had happened over the past several hours. "Then we should start now," she said. "Because if Charlotte is involved in this, I think I might know exactly where to find her." "Where?" Dominic asked, already moving toward the front hallway to retrieve his car keys. "She has a sister who lives across town, near the old textile mill," Elena said, following close behind him. "Charlotte mentioned staying there sometimes when things were difficult for her financially. It's the only address I remember her ever bringing up in conversation." Dominic turned to Daniel, who had followed them into the hallway despite his earlier ordeal. "Keep both men secured here. Call our attorney, Graham Ellsworth, and have him meet us tomorrow morning before the business meeting. I want everything documented properly. No mistakes. Nothing that could come back to complicate matters later." Daniel nodded firmly. "I'll handle it. Be careful out there, both of you." Dominic and Elena left the house quickly, climbing into Dominic's car, the night air cool against them as they pulled out of the driveway and onto the quiet residential streets. Elena directed him carefully, recalling details from conversations she had shared with Charlotte over the years, small pieces of information that suddenly felt significant given everything happening tonight. "You remember a lot about her," Dominic observed as they drove, the streetlights passing steadily overhead. "She used to talk to me sometimes, in the kitchen, when things got quiet in the evenings," Elena said. "She always felt like an outsider in that house, like her work was never truly appreciated, no matter how hard she tried. I think that feeling grew worse after she lost her position, especially since she always insisted she was innocent." Dominic considered this quietly as he drove, understanding the weight of feeling overlooked, undervalued, especially within a household where trust and loyalty were supposed to mean something. He wondered, not for the first time that night, how many other people around him carried similar frustrations without ever voicing them. They arrived at a modest apartment building near the old textile mill within 20 minutes, the structure worn but well kept, lights visible in several of the windows despite the late hour. Elena led him toward the third floor, pausing outside a door with a small handwritten name card taped beside the doorbell. Dominic knocked firmly but not aggressively. After a long moment the door opened partially, held by a chain lock, and Charlotte's face appeared in the gap, her expression shifting rapidly from confusion to alarm the moment she recognized who stood outside. "Mr. Marchetti," she said, her voice tight with nervousness. "It's late. What is this about?" "You know exactly what this is about," Dominic said calmly, though firmly. "I think it's better if we talk inside rather than through a chained door." Charlotte hesitated, glancing briefly toward Elena before closing the door momentarily to remove the chain, then opening it fully to let them inside. Her apartment was small but tidy, a single lamp providing soft light across a modest living room, where a laptop sat open on a small table, several browser windows still visible on the screen. "I didn't want any of this to happen the way it did," Charlotte said quickly, before Dominic could even speak, her voice trembling slightly. "I never wanted anyone hurt. I only wanted to prove that what happened to me was unfair, that I deserved better than being blamed for something I never did." "Someone broke into my home tonight," Dominic said evenly. "My head of security was restrained for hours. Documents were nearly stolen. And now I'm told there's something larger planned for tomorrow. I need to understand exactly what that is, Charlotte, and I need to understand it now." Charlotte sank onto the edge of a nearby chair, her hands trembling as she pressed them together in her lap. "Edward Callahan approached me, almost 2 months ago. He knew about how I was dismissed, knew I felt wronged, and he offered me money in exchange for information about the household. I told myself it was only information, nothing dangerous, nothing that could actually hurt anyone. And tomorrow," Dominic pressed gently but firmly. "What does he have planned?" Charlotte took a shaky breath. "He's planning to present falsified documents during your meeting tomorrow, papers designed to look like they came directly from your files, suggesting fraudulent arrangements with your business partners. He intends to plant doubt, make your partners question your integrity, hoping they'll withdraw from future arrangements and turn toward him instead." Dominic's jaw tightened at the extent of Callahan's scheme, a plan built entirely on manufactured distrust, rather than any legitimate business advantage. "How is he planning to present these documents?" "He has someone attending tomorrow's meeting as a representative of one of your partners," Charlotte said. "Someone he's convinced to distribute the false papers during a break in discussions, timed carefully to create maximum confusion before anyone can verify their accuracy." Elena, who had remained quiet until this point, finally spoke. "Charlotte, why didn't you say something sooner? Why let it go this far?" Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, her voice cracking slightly. "I was scared. Scared of Callahan, scared of what he might do if I backed out, and honestly, scared of admitting how badly I had let my anger control my decisions. But when I heard tonight that people had actually broken into the house, that Daniel had been hurt in some way, I couldn't sleep. I've been sitting here for the last hour trying to decide whether to call someone, anyone, and tell them everything." Dominic studied her carefully, weighing the sincerity behind her words against the seriousness of what she had already set into motion. Anger simmered beneath his calm exterior, but he recognized something valuable in this moment as well, an opportunity to correct tomorrow's crisis before it fully unfolded. "I need names," Dominic said. "Who is this representative planning to distribute the documents? And do you have copies of what Callahan intends to use?" Charlotte nodded quickly, moving toward her laptop and turning the screen so Dominic could see clearly. "He sent me copies weeks ago, wanting my opinion on how convincing they looked. I kept them, just in case I needed proof of what he was doing." Dominic leaned forward, examining the documents carefully. They were skillfully created, detailed enough to appear legitimate at first glance, though several small inconsistencies would become obvious to anyone who compared them against genuine records. "This is enough to expose him completely," Dominic said, "but we need to move quickly. If we can identify his representative and present this evidence before the meeting even begins, we can turn his entire plan against him." "His name is Martin Bradshaw," Charlotte said. "He works freelance, hired for exactly this kind of situation. He's attending tomorrow's meeting under the guise of representing your partner, George Whitfield's company." Dominic felt a fresh wave of frustration at hearing that Callahan had gone so far as to infiltrate a meeting under false representation, undermining not just Dominic's reputation, but the trust between legitimate business partners as well. "Send me everything you have," he instructed Charlotte. "Every document, every message, anything connecting Callahan to tonight's events and tomorrow's plan." Charlotte nodded, quickly gathering the files and transferring them to a small drive she handed to Dominic. "I know this doesn't undo what I've already done," she said quietly, "but I hope it counts for something." Dominic studied her for a long moment before responding. "It counts, but there will still be consequences for your part in tonight's events. I won't pretend otherwise. However, Your cooperation now will be considered when deciding how those consequences unfold. Charlotte nodded, accepting this with quiet resignation, understanding that her actions, however driven by genuine hurt, had crossed a line that could not simply be forgiven without accountability. Dominic and Elena left the apartment a short while later, the small drive containing crucial evidence tucked securely into Dominic's jacket pocket. The drive back toward the house was quieter, both of them processing everything that had unfolded over the past several hours. "You handled that well," Elena said eventually, breaking the silence. Calm, controlled, even with everything at stake. "It's not the first time someone has tried to undermine my reputation," Dominic said. "But it is the first time it's come this close to my own home, through people I once trusted." Elena glanced toward him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think Charlotte truly regrets what she did, or is she simply afraid of the consequences now that things went further than she expected?" Dominic considered the question carefully before answering. "I think both things can be true at once. People often make choices out of anger or desperation, choices they wouldn't otherwise make, and only recognize the full weight of those choices once consequences begin arriving at their door." They arrived back at the house just as the first hints of early morning light began touching the horizon, the night's events finally beginning to feel like they might resolve before the coming day's crisis fully unfolded. Daniel met them at the door, having remained awake through the night, his expression alert despite obvious exhaustion. "Our attorney is on his way," Daniel reported. "Should be here within the hour. What did you find?" Dominic held up the small drive. "Everything we need to expose Callahan's plan before it even begins. We have less than 6 hours before that meeting starts, and we need every one of them prepared." The house, which had felt so dangerously uncertain just hours earlier, now buzzed with a different kind of urgency, purposeful and controlled, as Dominic began organizing everything necessary to turn tomorrow's planned ambush into Callahan's own undoing. Elena moved toward the kitchen without needing to be asked, beginning preparations for coffee and a simple breakfast for everyone who would soon be working through the remaining hours before the meeting. Despite everything she had witnessed and endured throughout the night, her hands remained steady, her focus clear, the quiet competence that had defined her presence in this house for years, now fully visible for everyone to recognize. Dominic watched her for a brief moment from across the kitchen, understanding fully now what Daniel had observed earlier. Elena's quiet nature had never meant she was simply background to this household. It had meant she was paying attention the entire time, carefully, patiently, in ways that had ultimately protected everyone within these walls when it mattered most. The morning ahead would require careful preparation, precise timing, and complete coordination between everyone involved. But for the first time since stepping out of his car the previous evening, Dominic felt confident that whatever Edward Callahan had planned for today's meeting would collapse entirely under the weight of his own deception. By 9 in the morning, Dominic sat in his private conference room, the same room where he had hosted countless important discussions over the years, though few had ever carried this much tension beneath the surface. Graham Ellsworth, his longtime attorney, sat beside him, reviewing the documents Charlotte had provided, his expression sharpening with every page he turned. "These inconsistencies are subtle," Graham said, tapping a finger against one particular page, "but once pointed out, impossible to ignore. Wrong account numbers, dates that don't align with actual transaction records, even a signature that doesn't quite match previous samples on file. Enough to convince my partners it's fabricated," Dominic said, "provided we present it correctly." "More than enough," Graham confirmed. "The question now is timing. If Bradshaw distributes these during the meeting as planned, we need to be ready to counter immediately, before doubt has any chance to settle in." Elena entered quietly, setting down a tray with coffee for both men, though her presence in the room had shifted subtly since the previous night. She was no longer simply attending to household duties in the background. Dominic had specifically asked her to remain close throughout the morning's preparations, valuing her observations and steady presence as they finalized their approach. George Whitfield's actual assistant confirmed she never authorized anyone named Bradshaw to attend on her behalf, Elena reported, glancing at a message on her phone. "She's furious, honestly, and more than willing to state that clearly the moment she arrives." Dominic nodded, satisfaction settling into his expression for the first time since the previous evening. Then we make sure she's given the opportunity to say exactly that, at precisely the right moment. The meeting was scheduled for 11 that morning, held in the same conference room where Dominic now sat, giving them just enough time to finalize every detail of their response. Business partners began arriving shortly before 11, greeted warmly despite the underlying tension that only Dominic, Elena, and Graham were fully aware of. George Whitfield's genuine assistant, a sharp and composed woman named Sophie Larkin, arrived precisely on schedule, immediately expressing confusion when she noticed an unfamiliar man already seated near the head of the table, introducing himself as a representative from her own company. "I'm sorry," Sophie said, addressing the room directly, her voice carrying clearly despite her measured tone, "but I don't recognize you, and I certainly never authorized anyone to attend this meeting representing our company, besides myself." Martin Bradshaw's composure cracked visibly under the sudden scrutiny, several other business partners exchanging confused glances as the situation began unraveling faster than he had clearly anticipated. He attempted to recover, mentioning a supposed last-minute change in representation, but his explanation grew increasingly unconvincing under Sophie's direct and pointed questioning. Dominic allowed the confusion to build naturally for a moment longer before speaking, his voice calm and controlled despite the significance of what he was about to reveal. "Perhaps I can clarify the situation," he said, drawing the attention of everyone seated around the table. "Mr. Bradshaw was never sent by any of your companies. He was sent by Edward Callahan, with the specific intention of distributing falsified documents during this meeting, documents designed to damage the trust between myself and each of you." A ripple of surprise moved through the room, several partners glancing toward Bradshaw, whose expression had shifted from confidence to visible alarm. "I have proof," Dominic continued, nodding to Graham, who distributed copies of the genuine records alongside the falsified versions Charlotte had provided, allowing everyone present to compare the documents directly and see the inconsistencies clearly laid out. "These figures don't match anything in our actual arrangement," one partner said, examining the papers carefully. "This looks deliberately constructed to suggest fraud that never occurred." "Because it was," Dominic confirmed. "Constructed specifically for this purpose, timed for today's meeting, in an attempt to convince all of you that I've been operating dishonestly in our dealings together." Bradshaw rose from his seat abruptly, clearly recognizing that his position had become entirely untenable. "This is ridiculous," he said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Then perhaps you can explain," Sophie interjected sharply, "why you claim to represent my company when I never once spoke with you, never authorized your attendance, and have never even heard your name before this morning." Bradshaw had no adequate response, and within moments, it became clear to everyone present that his position had collapsed entirely. He gathered his things hastily and left the room without further explanation, his hurried departure serving as confirmation enough for everyone who remained. The room settled into a heavy but resolved silence following his exit, several partners exchanging glances that reflected both relief and lingering concern over how close they had come to being deceived. George Whitfield, joining remotely for the discussion, expressed his gratitude clearly once informed of the full situation, thanking Dominic directly for the transparency he had shown in addressing the matter immediately, rather than allowing suspicion to take root. "I appreciate you handling this so directly," George said through the call. "It would have been easy to simply proceed and let the confusion sort itself out over time. Instead, you addressed it immediately, with proof in hand. That says a great deal about your character." Dominic accepted the sentiment graciously, though internally, he understood how close this situation had come to unfolding very differently. Without Elena's warning the previous night, without Charlotte's late change of heart, without the swift actions of everyone involved throughout those tense early morning hours, today's meeting could have ended in exactly the kind of damaged trust and suspicion Callahan had hoped to create. The remainder of the meeting proceeded smoothly, business discussions continuing as originally planned, though now underscored by a stronger sense of trust between Dominic and his partners, rather than the doubt Callahan had intended to plant. By the time everyone departed that afternoon, Dominic felt a profound sense of relief settle over him, the weight of the previous night's danger finally beginning to lift. Later that evening, as the house returned to its usual quiet rhythm, Dominic found Elena in the kitchen, preparing dinner, despite everything that had happened over the past 24 hours. She looked tired, understandably so, though her movements remained steady and purposeful as always. "You should rest," Dominic said, leaning against the doorway. "You've more than earned it after last night." Elena smiled faintly, continuing her work without pause. "I find it difficult to simply stop, even after a day like today." Dominic stepped further into the kitchen, watching her for a moment before speaking again. "I've been thinking about everything that happened, about how differently tonight, and today, could have gone if you hadn't noticed something was wrong, if you hadn't waited by that door instead of assuming everything was fine." Elena paused, setting down the knife she had been using, meeting his gaze directly. "I only did what felt right in that moment. I couldn't simply go about my evening pretending I hadn't heard something unusual, not when it involved this house, and everyone in it." "It was more than that," Dominic said. "You've been paying attention this entire time, far more than anyone realized, including myself. That kind of awareness, that kind of loyalty, isn't something easily found or easily replaced." Elena's expression softened slightly, though she remained modest about the recognition. "I've worked in this house for 6 years. It matters to me, more than perhaps I've ever properly expressed." Dominic nodded slowly, understanding settling over him fully now. "I want to change your role here," he said. "Not simply as household staff, but as someone directly involved in decisions affecting security and daily operations. Your instincts proved more valuable last night than most people I've paid. Considerably more to protect this family." Elena looked genuinely surprised by the offer, her composure faltering slightly for the first time since Dominic had known her. "I never expected anything like that," she admitted. "I only wanted to make sure everyone here stayed safe." "Which is exactly why you deserve this," Dominic said firmly. "Loyalty like yours shouldn't go unnoticed, simply because it's quiet, rather than loud." Elena considered this for a long moment before nodding, a small but genuine smile finally reaching her expression. "Then I accept, gladly." Over the following weeks, the household settled into a new rhythm, one shaped significantly by the events of that tense night and the following morning. Daniel recovered fully from his ordeal, his respect for Elena's instincts growing considerably after witnessing firsthand how her attentiveness had protected the entire household. Charlotte, facing appropriate consequences for her involvement, cooperated fully with authorities regarding Callahan's broader activities, her genuine remorse ultimately factoring into how her situation was eventually resolved. Edward Callahan, exposed through documented evidence and witness testimony, found his business reputation collapsing far more thoroughly than any scheme he had attempted against Dominic. Partners who had once considered working with him withdrew entirely, unwilling to associate themselves with someone who had resorted to such deceptive tactics once his legitimate efforts had failed. Dominic often found himself reflecting on that night in the weeks that followed, recognizing how easily everything could have unfolded differently. A few minutes later arriving home, a few minutes of Elena hesitating instead of speaking up immediately, and the entire outcome might have been drastically altered. It reinforced something he had perhaps understood only abstractly before that night, that the people closest to daily life within a household often noticed far more than they were ever given credit for, and that true loyalty rarely announced itself loudly. Elena's new role within the household grew steadily over time, her quiet competence now fully recognized and valued rather than simply assumed as background routine. She continued moving through each day with the same careful attention that had defined her presence for years, though now everyone around her understood clearly just how significant that attention had always been. As for Dominic, the events of that single night reshaped how he approached trust within his own home, understanding now that protection came not only from carefully trained security personnel or elaborate precautions, but sometimes from the quiet, consistent presence of someone who simply paid close attention, cared deeply, and chose courage over silence when it mattered most. The house that had felt so dangerously uncertain during those tense early hours eventually returned fully to its familiar rhythm, filled once again with the quiet sense of security that had defined it for years before that night, though now built upon a foundation of trust that had been tested, proven, and ultimately strengthened by everything that had unfolded.